Thank you. Hello, everybody. This is Monica McLaughlin, and I'm with the National Network to End Domestic Violence. I manage our housing work, and we are part, at NNEDV, we are part of the Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium, which is funded by 4 federal agencies and in partnership with 4 nonprofit organizations, including Collaborative Solutions, the National Alliance for Safe Housing, and the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. I'm very pleased to welcome to our webinar, you to our webinar on how to build affordable housing for survivors today, which is September 27th, 2018. On today's webinar, you're going to be hearing from Mary O'Doherty and Andrea Miller from the Kentucky Coalition Against Domestic Violence about the inspiring work that they're doing in their state to provide affordable long-term housing solutions for survivors. I'm going to be fielding questions in the chat box, so if you have any questions, I'll be helping facilitate that section of it. The goal of the Domestic Violence and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium is to highlight the issues that bubble up from the field and to share the innovative work that's happening in the field. So that's one of the reasons we're having the Kentucky folks join us today. I know it is an interesting day to be on a webinar. We know there's lots going on in the media and the news today that's related to the work that many of us do on survivors. So hopefully this webinar is a space where we can say lots of innovation is happening and there's good work being done and we can breathe a little bit and take a break from all of that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mary and Andrea from Kentucky to begin today's Affordable Housing Development webinar. Hi, Mary and Andrea.
So, hey, Monica, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for making time for this presentation today. I think all of you deserve an award for dedication, for tearing yourself away from the Senate hearing and listening to our webinar. We very much appreciate your attention. So KCADV is a coalition of Kentucky's 15 state-funded programs, and over the last decade or so, our economic empowerment work has increasingly focused on housing. Working with our member programs, we house or provide rental assistance to about 150 families every year, and about half of those families live in the housing that we were able to build with low-income housing tax credits. So today, I'm going to tell you all about our adventure in housing. It began with a gift. The gift was a set-aside of low-income housing tax credits from our state housing finance agency. The set-aside came with instructions to build housing for survivors of domestic violence, and the amount of credits was very, very generous, enough to build 80 or more apartments. It was about 11 years ago, but I still remember the day that I learned about this gift. I was a project director at KCADV, and I had been summoned to a meeting of our state housing finance agency for an announcement about the tax credit distribution, the allocation plan. Most of the time, tax credits are awarded after a pretty intense competition among low-income housing developers, and many of them have very sharp elbows. And the fact that KCADV was given, just flat out given, a big chunk of tax credits was quite extraordinary. And I remember that I was trying to figure out what tax credits were when one housing developer after another came up to me, gave me his or her business card, and told me how much they cared about the issue of domestic violence. So I figured out that we had gotten something pretty good, but I just didn't know what to do with it, do with them. Well, so today, KCADV sponsors 72 units of housing for survivors at 5 locations across our state. We have 12 units that are just about to begin construction. We're going to schedule a groundbreaking very soon, and those units are in eastern Kentucky. About 170, or at least 170 survivors and their children live or have lived in our housing, which is on the campuses of our member domestic violence programs. So our programs refer tenants to the housing, and they provide case management services, and a property management company actually operates the units. So let's spend a quick minute talking about tax credits. The Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program was created under the Tax Reform Act of 1986, and it was done so to encourage and stimulate the construction of affordable housing. The IRS allocates tax credits to each state based on the population, and it requires that a portion of the housing that is built with the tax credits serve low-income families for at least 30 years. And developers will sell the credits to investors to raise capital for their projects, and that reduces the debt that the developer would otherwise incur. So we used our tax credits to build supportive housing, which is basically affordable housing combined with case management services. Most tax credit projects include a variety of funding sources, and our 3 projects have relied on funding from state and local housing trust funds, from HUD's home program, and private foundations. So I'm guessing that most people don't know that the low-income housing tax credit is responsible. It's the most important resource for creating affordable housing today. It's responsible for 90% of the affordable housing that's produced in the United States. It's obviously been a very successful example of public policy, but there are critics, especially among advocates for low-income families, that say not enough of that housing is constructed for the very poor or families with special needs. Although all but one state provides incentives for supportive housing, and at the end of our presentation, I'll have a link that will take you to a report put together by the Corporation for Supportive Housing, which lists each state and the incentives that each state provides for the development of supportive housing. So KCADV's tax credit set aside, the gift that I'm talking about, was a response to that criticism by the then chairman of our state housing finance agency, Kentucky Housing Corporation. The then chairman of that agency was really skeptical of developers who claimed that tax credit funded supportive housing projects were just too difficult to build and to operate. This fellow was a successful housing developer in his own right, so he was really in a good position, a good place to challenge those assumptions. All right. So one of the first things that we had to do when we started working with these tax credits was we had to come up with land to build the housing on, and that was actually one of the easier parts of our job. 3 of our member programs were excited about participating and had enough land next to their shelters that were suitable for housing. Pretty quickly after we lined up the programs that wanted to participate, we were able to work with a developer, a nonprofit developer. That part wasn't really that hard because so many of them wanted to work with us, because these tax credit projects have a fair bit of revenue in them, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. We also had, so after we found the developer, we had to find an architect and a property management company. So we found an architect, we found a property management company, and one of the first things that we had to do after we did that was negotiate with the property management with our developer about what's called a developer fee. Developers who build these projects are allowed to pay themselves developer fees, and that's reasonable because they also have to contract with the construction company that's going to build the housing and the architect, and they have to sign guarantees where they're agreeing to cover any additional costs if the construction goes over budget or if there are operating deficits while the housing is in use. We knew that the developer fee would be sizable, and we were able to negotiate that we split the fee because, we were the ones that had brought the tax credits to the table. And the developer agreed to that easily enough, but he was pretty hard-nosed about the guarantees. He thought that since we were getting half the developer fee, we should be willing to take half the risk. But our executive director showed her hard-nosed negotiating side, and she was able to she just insisted that that would not be the case. She said over and over again, we are a coalition of domestic violence shelters. We're not housing developers, and we are not going to take on this risk. Ultimately, the developer did agree to be the sole guarantee. So that was a tense moment, but it all worked out. Let's see. One of the things that I talked about, how we brought the tax credits to the table. Another thing that we bring to the table and needed to bring to the table for this project was rental assistance. That was in addition to coming up with land. We also were responsible for coming up with rental assistance, and we were able to do that because our programs had relationships with their housing authorities. And I need to just explain a little bit about why that was so important. The rental assistance is what makes these projects basically work. They're the fuel that keeps the engine running. The rental assistance pays for the operating costs, essentially. That the rental assistance pays for the maintenance, the management costs, repairs, and that sort of thing. By law, a portion of housing built with tax credits must serve low-income families who earn no more than 60% of the area median income, but the rents that these properties are allowed to charge are not affordable for very poor families. And by very poor families, I mean the kinds of families that we serve. Which usually, in our experience, tend to have incomes that are less than 30% of the area median income. Just sort of as an example, the families who live in our Lexington units pay $693 for a two-bedroom apartment, and I mean it's just pretty clear that without rental assistance, our families would not be able to live to be able to use our housing. So it's really critically important that they're able to do that. I'm going to skip ahead here. So we were able to work with two of our programs to come up with Section 8 vouchers that were provided by their local housing authorities, and then KCADV had a tenant-based rental assistance grant from HUD, and we now have a continuum of care grant from HUD, a rapid rehousing grant, and we're able to use those two sources to fill in the gaps for folks who need rental, for folks who aren't able to get those Section 8 vouchers. Okay, so the stars seem to be lining up for our first project in the summer of 2008. We had site plans, we had enough rental assistance to make the project cash flow, as they say, and we were meeting with program directors to talk about architectural plans, features of the housing that they wanted to make happen, when the financial crisis struck, and we almost lost our project. Our project nearly died on the vine because housing development of all stripes, as you may recall, slowed down dramatically, and investors who were buying tax credits were putting their money in safe projects, which were mostly like large single site projects in urban areas. Our project was considered very risky during the Great Recession, and our project would have died on the vine had it not been for President Obama's stimulus package. That package included funding to build low-income housing tax credit projects, and we benefited from that, and our construction began in 2010, and residents began moving in 2011. And I'm going to show you a few pictures of our housing now. You may recall at the very beginning of the presentation, I had a picture of about 22 units in the city of Louisville. That's the largest city in Kentucky. Those units are run with Section 8 vouchers from the Louisville Housing Authority. In Paducah, we have 12 units adjacent to our shelter, and we have also received rental assistance through the city's Section 8 housing program. Here's this is a picture of our housing in Moorhead, Kentucky, which is in eastern Kentucky, and these are 6 townhouse-style units. We pay for the rent there with tenant-based rental assistance. That's a HUD program, as well as our Continuum of Care Rapid Rehousing Grant. So the units all have, energy efficient appliances. All of them have Energy Star certified appliances, high efficiency toilets, showers, faucets. The Kentucky Housing Corporation required all of that, and we obviously thought it was a good idea. Very good windows, microwaves in every unit. And on the grounds of the projects, we have picnic tables and playgrounds and utility bills, which is nice because it's helped the survivors who live in the housing build some community. So we were flush with success after opening up that housing in 2011, and we were eager to build more of it. So with our developer, we went back to Kentucky Housing Corporation and asked for another set-aside, and we were turned down cold. We were told, you've shown us that you can do this. You need to go apply for those credits, those tax credits, just like everybody else. So we did, and we received tax credits with our developer, enough to build a $5.9 million project, which included 36 units in 3 cities. But this project also took a big hit when a zoning panel in the smallest, most low-income community that we were building in refused to give us a zoning change that we needed. We wanted to build 12 units in Hazard, which is an impoverished community in Appalachia, where the shortage of housing is extreme and the condition of much of the housing stock is just poor. Our state housing finance agency was so pleased that we were building in Hazard. They made a point of congratulating us on that, and we were heartbroken when residents of the city of Hazard did not agree that this was a good idea. They, folks who lived near the proposed site opposed the development, saying that they didn't want housing for low-income families nearby. And because we couldn't get the zoning change, we lost our tax credits, all of them. Part of the problem was angry residents showed up at 2 meetings at the city's Planning and Zoning Board, and public outcry just carried the day, and we lost all our tax credits. So we still had 2 other sites that we hoped to build at, and the deadline for the next funding round was looming. So we scrambled, and we were able to apply and were able to get tax credits for a smaller project, 24 units for families served by Greenhouse 17, our member program in Lexington. And this program is, I don't know what happened to the pictures. That's too bad. The pictures are gone. These units are single-story units. In the city of Lexington, we have 12 units on the site of our domestic violence program, which is a working farm, and then 12 units that are inside near the city center, which is good for survivors who, it's good for them to be close to jobs and commercial opportunities and that kind of thing. While our application for Lexington was under consideration, well, there's there's a good picture. These were single-story cottage-style units that needed to be single-story. They were more expensive to build because they were single-story, and it was a bit of a fight with our developers to get them to be built as single-story units because it is so much more expensive. But it was important because we were trying really hard to not alienate our neighbors. This shelter is in a rural area that's quite affluent, and we were really concerned about not generating any opposition because we'd learned our lesson in Hazard. So here's just a few more pictures from that day. The day, it was a year ago, about a little more than a year ago, that we had a ribbon cutting, and you can see that there were lots of elected officials who wanted to take advantage of the opportunity. And when I look at this slide, I think, how many elected officials does it take to cut a ribbon? Okay, so we, while that application was pending and while we were working on that, we filed a fair housing complaint with our state Fair Housing Council's help. We filed a fair housing complaint against the city of Hazard, and we were able to settle that. We received tax credits that allowed us to build 12 units that we're getting ready to break ground on next month. This slide says that the complaint was settled in September. That I've got the wrong year there. It took us a while after we settled the complaint to apply for the credits, and then, as I said, we're getting ready to start construction pretty soon. Before I hand over the baton to Andrea Miller, who's going to talk about what it's like to operate our housing program, I wanted to mention one really important part of our work and our ability to do this work has a lot to do with the property management company. Our property management company, whenever you do these sorts of projects, the property management companies have to have tenant selection plans. And when we were, because we had the tax credits, because they were our credits and because we were the ones that were bringing the developer and the other parties to the table, we were in a position to make some pretty important demands, I'll call them, for what we wanted, the kinds of survivors we wanted to be able to serve. And we thought that this housing should be available for all survivors, that we wanted it to be there for survivors who were struggling to get housing through their housing authorities or through their Section 8 programs. So we negotiated and were able to get in the tenant selection plan requirements that survivors with criminal records would be able to live in this housing. We negotiated provisions that made it possible for even survivors with murder convictions would be able to live in our housing, because we had just recently helped a number of women get their sentences commuted, survivors who had been convicted of domestic violence-related serious homicide charges. So fresh from that, we thought it was really important to make sure that we were able to house a family like that who needed it desperately. So the other thing that we were able to do was get the housing, the Winterwood Property Management Company to agree that before they made any kind of effort to evict one of our families, that they would talk to us about it first. And I'm here to say that we've really done well with this property management company. I think we and our member programs have a really strong relationship with it, and it's a function of really good communication, regular meetings, and efforts by the Winterwood staff to understand and work around the challenges that so many of our families present. So now I'm going to hand the baton over to Andrea Miller, who is responsible for running our project and who is also responsible for a lot of that good communication with our housing, with Winterwood Property Management Company that I was talking about. So Andrea, why don't you take it away?
Sure, thanks Mary. I do think Mary has the harder part with the whole tax credit and organizing all of the people that are involved in building the units between the architect and the investors, all that kind of stuff. To me, that's that's like incredibly hard. It's like herding cats. I think we were giving her the Expert Herding Cat Award at one point to pull all that together and build those beautiful units. And they are all, quite frankly, very beautiful. Many residents comment that it is the prettiest place they've ever lived, nicest place they've ever lived, and they feel safe, which is, of course, the most important part for us. We did get into housing as part of our economic empowerment work because housing, of course, is the first thing that people ask for when they're either coming from an outreach perspective or in shelter. And so when we started with the tax credit programs, that housing piece is critical for our economic empowerment work because most people can't effectively participate in economic empowerment work until they're safely or stably housed. So it was just a natural, actually, addition to our job. I'm going to talk a little bit about our work with Winterwood, which is our property manager. I'm going to share some stories and kind of a little bit about the project itself. So with Winterwood, what we found, and it was, we were part of the tenant selection plan. We actually wrote quite a bit of it ourselves. We were able to get that approved. It's different from many other tenant selection plans that are operated by Winterwood, but also across the state. So we have been able to successfully house survivors who could not get housing somewhere else because of a criminal history, because of some sort of status. We were able to build family reunification into our project, which meant that we could allow a survivor to move into housing if she didn't have her children with her, but we could give her the unit that she was qualified for with children, so that would allow any social worker plans that were going on at the state level. She would be able to come into that unit. She would have housing, which is one of the main requirements for reunification. And then we would give her that time to get her kids back. And so we were able to negotiate that also with our property manager and with our funding sources for the housing. We have regular meetings. It's every month with each property and the management company and the housing advocates that are in that area. So, for example, in Moorhead, we have a call every month with our housing advocate in Moorhead, and we have a call with Winterwood at the same, all of us are on the call together, and we're discussing the residents in those units and what's happening so that we can make sure they're able to stay housed, stay safe. So there's a really tight relationship there. When a tenant is having trouble with maintenance or is having trouble with getting her rent in on time or even paying her rent, we'll look at what sources do we have at KCADV that can help that individual to stay on track. So, for example, we have a flexible emergency fund that we could use to help that tenant pay some other expense. Then they can use their funds to pay their rent because we want to get people in the habit of paying housing costs first. That's rent and utilities. And so that's a pretty important thing, working with the housing advocate. And then our housing advocate can talk with the property manager and help the tenant talk to the property manager about getting things fixed if there's something wrong in the unit. So we're encouraging that dialogue between the tenant and the property manager. And then the property manager, if they're hearing things from the tenant that are DV related or crisis or safety related, they're encouraging that tenant to go, you know what, we should probably bring your housing advocate into this conversation, or you should talk with your housing advocate. Can we make that happen? And so that's one way for us also to make sure that someone is staying safe in the unit. And if we need to use VAWA or our state law that helps victims move if their housing isn't safe anymore, we can get out of that lease without a penalty to that victim, and then we can make sure that they relocate somewhere else safely, again, with continued housing assistance. So I can't really stress enough how important it is to have a really great relationship with the property manager and with the housing advocates and with KCADV, all of us working together with the primary goal of keeping our person safely housed and having them be able to reach goals that they've outlined in a client plan that they've created with their advocate that works on safety and financial empowerment goals. The eviction piece, as Mary mentioned, that's also true when someone has gotten behind in their share of the rent, and we've been trying and trying and trying to keep them housed or find ways to help them work through this, and it's just not working. We'll actually try to work to have the tenant voluntarily vacate so that there's not an eviction on their record, and maybe someplace else is where they need to go or want to go. And we have had a few evictions, not a lot. I'm super happy about that. But we try so hard to make sure that everything works really smoothly with these regular conversations that we have either by phone or in person. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about Tanisha, who is the person that's on this slide that you see in front of this car that she purchased, which is from using our car IDA. So Tanisha was living in our housing. She had left her abusive husband, moving into her own home with her lovely little girl there. And with help from the housing advocate, one of the things that they discovered was she had a job, but she was having so much difficulty getting to and from her job and getting her child to daycare and school. She's in Louisville, which is a metropolitan area, largest city, as Mary mentioned. They have a transit system, but just being honest, in Kentucky, even our couple cities that have transit systems, they're not very efficient. And so we love our car IDA program because of that. It was created for that reason. So the advocate talked to her about the car IDA program, and she was very interested in that. All of our IDA programs, those are individual development accounts. They are matched savings programs. All of them require financial education. And so one of the things that Tanisha said that I always thought was really interesting is that she started taking financial education because it's required as part of the program, and she wanted to be prepared for her new investment. And making a budget was, a direct quote is, it was like a reality check for her. Because she said she wasn't paying attention to certain details of her income and her spending. And this was something that was really critical since she was now going to be a car owner, and there are costs associated with that. And we also wanted to make sure that she was able to stay in housing and stay housed while she's saving for the car IDA. And then when she gets her car, that she's also able to add that into her circle of necessary expenses. She worked on her credit also while she was in our housing program. She was able to get a credit card and built her credit score. She limited her spending, followed all of the guidance that we give about how to build, establish, maintain good credit. She opened her IDA in 2016, and she had her car purchased about 9 months later. That's about average for us. It takes someone about 9 months in order to save. Usually they save the full $2,000 in that time that we will match, and she was no exception to that. And she bought her Toyota using her car IDA. And one of the things that she's a kind of a success story. We also will have our success stories come and share their experiences with people in housing and or people in shelter, so that there's it's a motivation, I think, and also a help for people to know that if this person can do this, who's had similar experiences to me, I can do this too, and so it's a really great opportunity. So again, I talked about working with the programs, our member programs that are involved in this tax credit housing, and the property management Winterwood, which is for all of those units. And then my job is to make sure that the units are filled so that the flow into and out of the units doesn't leave big gaps. This is part of how the project stays successful, is if we can maintain, if we can keep units filled. And then we also, of course, want all of the other things that go along with property management, making sure that the property is maintained, making sure that all of the residents are safe, making sure that people aren't moving in people that they shouldn't. And I say that because people's household composition can change, and we want those to be safe changes, obviously. And when people are ready to move on out of the tax credit housing, which our programs have said they want for their women and their children. So when people are ready to enter into other relationships, that's a point in time when we would want to say that that person's probably graduated. And so they've graduated this project, and we will help them to find housing out in the community for that status change for their families. Part of the thing that KCADB does is do the rental assistance. That is operated out of our office. So we create the subsidy worksheets We calculate all the changes in income and household composition. We prepare the checks and send those out to the property manager. Our member programs actually refer the families and help the families get their application information together. They also will provide the case management and be working monthly or even weekly on some occasions with families who are in the housing. And then they will help us kind of maintain a waiting list for people who want to move into the housing. And so I'm going to talk a little bit now about our economic empowerment work and how that ties in. And so anyone that's in our housing, anyone that's working with one of our member programs has access to all of our financial empowerment menu items. And some people can start them right away. Other people need a little bit of time to get used to being in housing, paying for housing costs, getting those basic needs met. And so once someone is ready, and assuming that this is part of their client plan, the goals that they want for themselves, or goals that they'll talk about something that they want to do, and the advocate can hear that and say, you know, we have something that might help you with that. Would you like some information on that? And then we will talk about using a match savings program or an individual development account. We'll talk about the microloan, which is designed to help people who want to work on credit building. We'll talk about sitting down on budget and credit coaching, particularly budgets, because we find that many people who are coming in haven't been used to using a written budget, which we think is most effective. But we just want people to understand that managing of that money and putting that housing cost first again. And some people have been significantly financially abused and have never had the opportunity to manage their finances, so this is a chance for them to talk through some of the struggles they might have with an advocate who can listen and then provide a resource that might help that individual. We do offer workshops that we will give transportation to if that's necessary from housing, or have them in the housing itself. So one of the properties actually has some space where they do meetings, regular meetings with clients, and talk about things that clients want more information about, which might be how do I find a bank, or how do I set up my budget, or how do I improve my credit, what kind of loans should I be looking for, things like that. But we will have outside experts that will come in and deliver that information, as well as trained advocates. And then we can talk about emergency assistance that I mentioned earlier. We do a campaign every year. We're getting ready to gear up for that now. It's Purple Purse. It's through the Allstate Foundation. It's a great opportunity for us. We raise 100% of what we raise in that campaign is for our emergency fund to help our survivors with what they need assistance with. And that, again, could be something like sometimes it's old utility debt that someone needs to clear before they can move into housing. Sometimes it's someone lost some hours on their job. It's not sufficient to adjust a voucher, but we might need to help them with a household expense so that they can continue to pay their rent or utilities. Sometimes people's transportation breaks down. Sometimes people have difficulty with child care. One thing that we sometimes see is that people who are, when they come into our housing, are at zero income or unemployed. Once they get a job and they have children, they need to pay child care. Child care requires that they're paying up front. They haven't gotten a paycheck yet. So that emergency fund can help them to establish that child care, get it set up so that they have reliable child care in order for them to be able to stay employed. And then we also do free tax prep, and that one always seems like an outlier for a lot of people, but I'm just going to say that most of the survivors that we work with are paying $300 and $400 to get their taxes done if they're not doing them themselves. We have some survivors who have done their taxes on their own. They feel really comfortable with that. And others, no, they've always used a paid preparer. And they are getting charged a significant amount of money for just a really easy tax return. So KCADV has been involved in tax prep since 2004. And it's a great opportunity because we can also go back and help survivors correct a return that was done improperly, or that didn't take advantage of any credits that they might have been able to claim, like earned income tax credit. We're also able to refer them to a low-income taxpayer credit if they have issues with their spouse, so they can file for innocent spouse relief if that family had tax issues that were the result of that perpetrator. We can also, when we file that back 3 years, it can be an amazing thing for someone. We recently did that for a woman who was getting ready to move into housing. We filed back 3 years for her, and she was able to have almost $20,000. That was like life-changing money for her. She had now money to pay off some education debt. She could get into housing and stay safely housed. So it can be a really big thing. So anyone who's doing tax credits, I'm not telling you that you have to do free tax prep as well. I am suggesting that you might look in the community for places that do that to help the persons that are in your housing to be more successful. And I'm going to move on to the next slide where we've talked before about sometimes our housing is the only option that a survivor might have because of poor rental history or criminal history. And so we kind of divide our housing population into kind of 3 groups. The first is that group. We're the place where they can start to build a good rental history and a good, strong housing history, and or work on other things like immigration issues that are preventing them from being housed. They tend to be longer term in the amount of time that they spend in our housing. Then we have a middle group, which is our largest group, despite the question mark that's there. It is, in fact, our largest group, and they are the ones who seem to need our economic empowerment services, supportive services, the case management piece. They need it the most. And these are typically people who have mostly lived in poverty for their lives. They have had difficulty maintaining stable income for whatever reasons, domestic violence included, particularly. That tends to be the bulk of the housing clients. And then we have a smaller number of survivors who have, who either have or are able to develop a stable source of income, and who need some domestic violence support while they're getting housed. And they usually move on in about 15 to 18 months out, and this is usually after they've obtained a housing choice voucher, or their income is sufficient for them to go to market rent, or they become ineligible for housing because they're now, the rental assistance that's tied to the housing, you can't be over a certain income level at a recertification. And so at that point, they become, they're over income for our housing, so they are definitely going to market rent. And for those who do the housing choice voucher, I'm going to talk a teeny bit about that. So after 1 year in our housing program, a person, we can apply for what's called a domestic violence preference with our state housing agency, Kentucky Housing Corporation, and they serve 87 counties across the state. All of our programs are all of our housing programs are located in that area, with the exception of the city of Paducah and the Louisville metropolitan area and the Lexington area. So the Louisville metropolitan area and the Paducah area, they have agreed to give us a graduation voucher. So what that means is after 1 year in that tax credit housing, if that survivor feels comfortable and is ready to move on, they have a permanent choice housing voucher that they can take with them. It's through Louisville Metro or through the city of Paducah. And we're kind of working an arrangement with Lexington to see if we can get that, but it hasn't happened yet. But we really like that Metro Louisville and Paducah have offered that up, because that ties in with what we see with our state housing partner as well. And those vouchers, once they're given, I always refer to them as the golden ticket, because you can take them anywhere. You can go anywhere in Kentucky. You might have to go through a different area to actually activate it, but you can take it throughout the state. You can leave the state and take it across state lines, and then work with the housing authorities in the area that you're moving to keep that permanent housing voucher with you when you go. And we always want to make sure that our survivors who are getting that voucher understand its portability, because we had just recently even a survivor who's in our housing for about 18 months. She got her Section 8 voucher from our state, and at that time she was deciding to move back to Illinois. And so we were like, you have to get your housing voucher from Kentucky first, then you can port to Illinois, and you'll have your portable voucher there, and you won't have to wait on any Illinois list. So that is a big success for us when she was able to make that work. We do have about a 98% rate of people going out to permanent housing from our housing program, and that's pretty exciting for us. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about our next story, and this is Nisha Ganster, and and that is Ganster, not gangster. Sometimes people think they spelled it wrong. But Nisha is also one of the successes of moving into the housing. She was in kind of between a couple of our programs, one out in western Kentucky called Sanctuary, which is in Hopkinsville, and then also the Merriman House, which is in Paducah. And the son of her father, who was also her perpetrator, was living in, she was in the Murray area, so we have they're under the same program, the Merriman House. And then the Murray units are actually subsidized through KCADV's TBRA and COC grants. And so when she was out in that Murray area, kind of going back and forth between those two areas, she needed housing because of domestic violence. She actually found out about the Merriman House and the Domestic Violence Program Sanctuary from a friend when she was talking with her friend and disclosed her problems with domestic violence. And she had seen or heard about the housing, but she didn't know how to access services. So the friend helped her connect with the programs, and she and her son moved into the housing in November. At that point, she had no credit score, and she was unemployed. She worked with an advocate at the Merriman House on budgeting as she was living in housing and on credit building. She opened up a microloan, and she started saving in an IDA. The biggest thing she said that did for her was help her control her spending. She said that was the most important thing that happened. Yes, she had housing and she had a roof over her head, but for her, getting controlling of her spending was the thing once she got employed that she needed the most help with. She also enrolled in Murray State University and studied information technology. And then she moved in 2015 because she had gotten a job after an internship that she had, and she was no longer income eligible to stay in the housing. She's employed now still as a network security specialist, and she works in Hopkinsville, and she lives in Bowling Green. And she's jumped her credit score up through the work that she did and through her microloan and her other credit building up to a 774, which is pretty phenomenal. And she's closing on a house with our match savings program for home ownership next month, about the middle of the month, around the 15th. Again, she said that working with the advocate, whose name is Lupita, I'll give Lupita a big shout out here, that was the most helpful thing, along with the time it took her to formulate a plan and get on track with what she wanted her life to look like for her and her son. She thinks that the supports are very helpful. She talks about that a lot, and especially when people are ready to move forward after experiencing domestic violence. Those support systems in place are critical. And then I'm going to go to the next slide. And I'm going to let Mary chat about this slide for supportive housing because she's the expert in this area and in promoting supportive housing. And so I'm going to turn that back over to her. And thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Andrea. That was really good. This is our last slide, and I just want everyone to know that there is a document that you can go to find out what the housing credit policies are in your state. This is a document that's put together by the Corporation for Supportive Housing, and the Corporation for Supportive Housing looked at every state's plan for allocating tax credits, and if you look at it, you'll see that there are almost every state but one, according to this report, has a plan for or a program for using tax credits to build supportive housing. So that's it. That's all we got. Thanks very much for your attention, especially today.
Thank you, Mary and Andrea. I was wondering if we do have a little bit of time, I think, left. I'm just wondering if folks want to do any questions. Very thorough, you had a very thorough PowerPoint, so maybe folks won't have any. I will say that I think it's, just as an observer of it, it's really amazing to see you all building what you needed in your communities, and it's exciting that the domestic violence community has these opportunities. So I just make sure that no one has any questions. Yes, you're sharing that. This is wonderful. I agree. I appreciated this break. I'm going to actually, my body feels different. So thank you, Mary and Andrea, for doing that. So if there's no other questions, then I think this brings us to the end of the webinar. We are very thankful and grateful to Mary and Andrea for taking the time to share their expertise. I'm so excited about their projects. We'll send out the PowerPoints from today's webinar as well as a recording for you to use as a reference and to share with colleagues. And then all of our information is available on safehousingpartnerships.org. This will be on that website as well as many other resources on the intersection of domestic violence, housing, and homelessness. We thank you all for participating and hope that you have a day where you can do lots and lots